is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Today's guest is responsible for covering schools spread out over more than 250,000 square miles. In other words, the entire Lone Star State. Aliyya Swaby is here to talk about her work as the public education reporter for the nonprofit Texas Tribune, some of the hot stories she's digging into, and what she's learned so far about managing a massive beat. Aliyya, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
You came to Texas about 3 years ago after covering schools for a hyperlocal news outlet. That was the New Haven Independent in Connecticut. To say you went from one end of the beat-sized spectrum to the other, I think it's almost an understatement.
Yes, definitely. I mean, New Haven Public Schools is a lot smaller than, covering 1,200 plus school districts across the state of Texas. And it was definitely a culture shock, and then also just a shock in terms of the scope of my job and the kinds of stories I was going to be doing.
How do you deal with that? Were there other people you could talk to about sort of getting ready for this, or was it just jumping in the deep end of this pool?
It was just jumping in the deep end for me. I started in October 2016, so right before that presidential election, and then also right before a state legislative session. And those happened in Texas in odd years. So I was really just jumping in, talking to lawmakers immediately, all of the different advocates, all of the different superintendents and teachers and key players come to Austin and are in the Capitol at that point. And so, from January to May was just basically a boot camp for me to learn some of the main issues, some of the key players, and then just really get up to speed very quickly.
I imagine there were plenty of differences compared to what you were experienced at covering. What were some of the similarities you found, though, as you crossed from one end of the beat to the other?
I think it was useful for me to have started at such a local level, especially with an editor who really prioritized getting the most local story possible in a hyperlocal newspaper, traveling with one student to see their route to school, those kinds of stories, and then having to figure out how can I still do those stories and make them relevant on a state level scale, I think has made me a better reporter at the Texas Tribune. Some of the similarities are, I knew already how challenging it was to cover school level politics. The fact that there's never just one community statement that encompasses everyone's opinions on any matter at all. I think starting at a state level and then going local, I don't think I would have been as prepped for those local level debates and knowing how to parse through them to be able to tell a story that's nuanced and accurate.
We've talked a little bit, of course, about Texas's size, but let's talk about some of its challenges. Give us a sense of what are the big issues right now statewide for Texas in education.
The most recent big issue in Texas is that the state has just announced that it plans to take over its largest school district, which is the Houston Independent School District. That was earlier this week. And now, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of confusion. It's kind of hard to overstate the impact of this. It's one of the largest districts in the entire country. Definitely, top 10 in the country, and the state of Texas will soon be responsible for appointing a new school board for this district. I think that's one that's getting a lot of national attention right now.
Well, certainly, that's a big issue for a lot of places. We're looking at the state takeovers that's happening in a tiny state in Rhode Island. Where do you start as the reporter on that? Are you looking at the research? Are you looking at the other examples? Places like Newark, New Jersey, where, a state takeover just wasn't the right answer for them.
I'm definitely starting to dig into those past examples in other states, but then also within Texas. Texas has taken over other school districts before. A lot of them in more recent years have been smaller ones. There are a couple in San Antonio that are much smaller than Houston ISD. And the hard part about comparing these is that there are different factors that led to each one. Some of them were more related to academics. Some of them were more related to dysfunction or scandals, or, in El Paso ISD, there was a cheating scandal that led to them being taken over by the state. It's hard to compare the results that you get because there were different intentions to taking each one of them over, let alone then comparing a giant Texas school district to others across the country with different contexts.
I think it's a fascinating story. And certainly, I think one of the reasons eyes are turned to Texas on this is this question about local control, which has really been highly prioritized.
Yes, definitely. I mean, in Houston, there have been a lot of conversations, to the point even of fights, I think, about whether or not Houston ISD should pursue a route that's closer to either giving some of the low performing schools over to a charter or a nonprofit to run them, which the state of Texas has been really active in trying to incentivize across the state. And Houston basically said no. It could have been a move that prevented this takeover, because of the way that the state law works and the way that they're trying to incentivize some of these new alternative forms of governance. And there's a very loud faction of activists there that basically forced the school board to back down on this.
You've also been doing some really in-depth work on school segregation, including a big project for the Texas Tribune, the Disintegration Project. Tell us a little bit more about how that came to be.
I worked on that project with the demographics reporter, Alexa Uda here, and we both came to each other with it separately. Texas in 2011, its school system became majority Hispanic, and it's just getting diverse, more and more Hispanic and low income. And so we figured it would be an interesting way to talk about segregation and the legacy of school segregation, especially since a lot of stories we'd seen are mainly around, the disparities between Black and white students. And so a lot of our stories ended up being about what does it mean when you have this new, very quickly growing population coming in. And we found that it meant for a lot of federal judges that they basically dismissed these older desegregation orders for these districts. That was something that was really interesting and that we hadn't seen a lot of in our search of what reporting was like on this issue in Texas.
And I think that's a good tip there for other local reporters to go out and take a look and find out, were there desegregation orders in place? Are they still there? Have they been followed? In some cases, these things just sort of lapse and are frozen in time, even though they're still in there.
Definitely. We went to Longview ISD and they had just been released from their desegregation order, but they had been following it. But then we reached out to others and we found people who didn't even know that they were under a desegregation order. It was that dead. So it really varies.
So, Aliyya, your story makes some really important connections here between the impact of white flight, white families leaving the school system to avoid putting their kids in desegregated classrooms. But you also look at the impact of that on a school system's entire infrastructure, specifically how it can hurt their chances of passing future construction bonds and raising the funds that would theoretically improve schools for everyone. Explain to us a little bit about how you picked up that thread.
So, white flight is definitely one of the things that you have to talk about when you're reporting on the legacy of segregation, anywhere, including in Texas. We started with this thread in our first story in this series, which was set in Longview, which was a rural school district in East Texas. And we found that when the school board moved to integrated schools and put Black students' schools at the same level in terms of having the infrastructure that wasn't crumbling and having the right technology, when it tried to get those schools to the same level as schools that were majority white, people who had left the school district, often white families, didn't want to vote for it. Their kids weren't in those schools, and so there was some resistance to paying for kids who were left in the public school system.
We're talking with Aliyya Swaby, public education reporter for the Texas Tribune. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Aliyya, you obviously can't cover everything. So how do you pick and choose those battles? What is a Texas Tribune education story?
We have a list of questions as an organization that we go through to figure out if something is a Texas Tribune story, whether or not it holds someone accountable or if it's relevant to an audience outside of the Capitol insiders. Also, I'm looking for stories that relate back to some sort of state policy or state politics, either something that the state is or isn't doing that can be shown to impact people who are outside of state lawmakers. Often I look for stories that are indicative of certain trends or that really buck the trend or buck the traditional narrative, because often I'm doing this reporting during the legislative session or in the context of the state legislative session. Lawmakers are not often going to all of their public schools. I think they hear from certain constituents. And so there's the opportunity for me to bring to light communities and voices that they won't necessarily have heard from.
How much do you share with your readers and audience about how you're making those decisions?
The Texas Tribune has a series of events and there are ways in which we're building uh, real life opportunities to meet people and to bring that coverage to light. I'm thinking of when I reported on the impact on schools of Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and I was able to actually create a panel of teachers and principals and students out of the stories that I wrote. And that's one where it was clear why I had made those decisions. It was clear in the event who was impacted and what the focus was. But I think it can be hard sometimes when I'm not focusing on every single district. And obviously, if you're in a community, those are the schools you're going to focus on. And I can't be a local reporter everywhere. That's something that's hard to communicate.
But it sounds like you do try to keep your local reporter lenses on while you're actually out doing the story.
Yes, definitely. And again, I think that's from starting as a local reporter. I don't think hopefully, I'll never stop feeling like I have those tools and like I can always, put that hat on when I'm reporting, even at a state level.
When I covered the Clark County School District in Las Vegas, managing the explosive growth was the underlying theme to a lot of the coverage. And it was also true in a lot of the phone calls that I would get. Probably one of the most common ones was parents asking me which were the best schools because they were moving to the area. What do people want to know when they call you?
When I get questions, it's more about state level policies that people are feeling locally and they don't know what the state is doing about it. I think people understand that I'm not their local reporter, but they want to know, why is this a problem I'm having? Wasn't the state supposed to do something about it? I'm thinking about, the students with disabilities and parents of those students. The state is supposed to be working on that issue, but yet parents and students are in some schools still feeling like not much has changed. So I get a lot of those calls and emails.
Has there been a roadblock for you since you took over the beat that you've had to overcome? Maybe a tip for reporters out there?
I think the ongoing challenge for me is making sure that I'm balancing the state and the local in each story I cover. And I do try and make sure that I'm reaching out to as many people as possible. Now I'm not based in Houston, obviously, but I have been reaching out to different parent groups and trying to connect with people who are very in the know and then people who are not so much. And I think just consistently sourcing local is something that I found, even if I don't write it like the local reporter would, it's always going to be useful to have that context, no matter what the ultimate angle ends up being.
I often tell local reporters a great place to find sources is at the mall. So if it's the holiday season, you're going to find teachers working at the clothing stores, picking up that extra job shift. You're going to find the high schoolers hanging out in the food court. But these days, it feels like Twitter serves a lot of that purpose. And I'm wondering how you use social media to network.
I have been using Facebook a lot lately. I've been trying to do more stories on student discipline. And, there are a lot of active parent groups and active teacher groups. And those have been really helpful to me, actually. And I can't be in every district, but I can at least start a thread in a Facebook group and potentially get some good sources out of it. And even if I don't have that, the responses are indicative of where at least some people are on an issue.
Aliyya, before we let you go, I did want to ask you, what advice might you have for other education reporters who are trying to balance some pretty big beats?
What I have learned as a state level reporter, there are always hearings, public hearings in Austin where people are talking to state lawmakers about the issues that they're having. And I think often instead of just writing from those hearings, I'll just go up to them and ask to come by at some point and drive over there. I think, especially as a state level reporter, I think getting out of the office, even though it's more challenging and often means driving 6+ hours, that's the way I've found several stories now is hearing from people from all over the state. I'll hear something that sounds interesting either because it's not what I know that people think about an issue or because it's bucking the trend in some way. And it's really the main way that I have felt comfortable being able to say, really anything about the way that public education works in a state as big as Texas.
Aliyya Swaby is the public education reporter for the Texas Tribune. She was an EWA Awards finalist in 2017 for beat reporting and a Livingston Awards finalist this year for a series on schools desegregation. Aliyya, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.